So I wanted to lay out a little bit of the life of Keats, really small amount. So if you have bigger questions, please do ask at the end, because I do want to focus mostly on the readings. And I'm very aware with talking about poetry that people don't want to be kind of taught about poetry necessarily, like, you know, what this line and what the meter is and what I think it all means. There will be a bit of that, but it's more laying out the ideas behind it and then just letting you enjoy the readings, and I'll have the text up each time. So a bit of context. Keats was born in this area of Moorgate in north central London, 1795, to three other surviving siblings, to two parents who were together. But when he was, I think, 8 or 9 years old, his dad fell off a horse while visiting them at school and sort of broke his neck and died, which was pretty traumatic. And then his mum remarried and then went off with this man, leaving Keats and his siblings with his grandparents, with their grandparents. And then his mother came back into his life while he was away at school, kind of again away from his grandparents. And at the age of 14, then she died. So he had these two losses of his parents at a very young age. So this was already quite a powerful moment for him. And perhaps because of this, or perhaps not, at school, it's recorded that he escaped a lot into literature, or he, you know, the word escaped doesn't come up, but he had this great passion for focusing on literature and trying to know everything about literature, both modern stuff at the time, but also works back from the classical Greek and Roman world. He was quite a boisterous guy at school. He could have big fits of anger. So he wasn't just this lazy, you know, very overly sensitive poet writing about love and beauty. He had quite an adventurous, boisterous, energetic side. So in 1815, after school, he was in the care of two kind of carers for him, or I forget the word, patrons or something. And he went to study at Guy's Hospital as a surgeon, as an assistant surgeon. So he was busy with cutting up bodies and operating on people with pretty nasty medical situations. So no painkillers and kind of pretty nasty, facing death on a daily basis and a lot of suffering. But around his time in London, in more central London, he was getting involved in literary scene. Who became a close friend, Leigh Hunt, who was a journalist and a writer in his own right, who was covering other writers, such as the existing literary scene. And he actually published some books in 1817 and 1818, but they didn't get very poetry books, this is. But they got very scathing reviews. One of them said, basically, you're not well educated, you're writing in a ridiculous modern style, go back to school, or go back to the apothecary, John. Very scathing reviews. But he was reading people who were writing in the Romantic movement. So Keats is labeled, if you want to label him, as a second generation Romantic poet. But the first generation, people like Wordsworth over here, Coleridge, and William Blake, who are writing after some years of the Industrial Revolution, writing after some years of the Enlightenment, you know, this obsession with reason and science and carefully ordering everything out to its nice finish and putting a little equals and then putting the number what it all equals. And these writers were rebelling against that. They were focused on the individual feeling, the importance of emotions, often very deep, powerful emotions, be it loss or sadness or joy or the awe of nature. So it was quite internal, it was very internal, and it was drawing upon the autobiographies, the lives of these writers. It was a lot to do with nature as well. So Keats was growing up in this new era of literature, a new kind of style, more open-hearted writing. Also a big influence was Thomas Chatterton, who was from the later 1700s. So he wasn't really part of the Romantic movement officially, but also had a very personal, quite anguished, searching writing style that was kind of very laid bare, who killed himself at the age of only 17. So Yeah, this is a painting of him having killed himself. So in 1818, Keats actually got tired of living in pretty horrible places in London, and he moved to the Wentworth house in Hampstead, owned by someone who knew Charles Wentworth. And it was at this time, shortly before this time, in December 1818, that his brother, who was very, really dear to him, Keats in his letters writes that siblings were dearer to him than the love of women, or the idea of love of women. His brother Thomas died of tuberculosis, and it's thought that it's at this time when Keats was caring for him that he himself got tuberculosis. And of course it then came out in his life and killed him in 1821, only a few years later. Here's the plaque, and it's a house, it's still there, and it's a museum to Keats and to his poetry and life. It's also here that he met Fanny Brawne, who was living for a time in the house and then lived close by. And he fell in love with her kind of gradually over time in 1819. But it didn't work out. It's quite tragic. He had to go to Rome later on in his life in 1820 to try and recover from tuberculosis, and died without seeing her ever again, without being able to marry her, without being able to even consummate their relationship. When he died, she went into mourning for 6 years or so. So they had a really close bond, and yeah, it's quite a tragic young love story. Just an old photo of the house here. And Keats was walking around Hampstead a lot. The year before, he had gone on a huge trip around the UK up to the Scottish Islands, and he really was quite a traveller before and an explorer. And we'll talk about Ode to a Nightingale later, one of his famous odes. And there is a story that he wrote that, or inspired to write that, while in the garden of the house, listening to a nightingale singing. But a few months before, he had been for a walk with Coleridge, and Coleridge was writing that he had already talked about nightingales and immortality and the nature of beauty and the nature of poetry. So these ideas were already kind of going through his head in Hampstead. And a quote here, so before I start reading the odes, as I don't want to talk about each one before too much, I'm kind of laying up some of the ideas before, which you'll see in quite a lot of the odes. I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. So this is from the time in 1818 and 1817 when he's mixing with these literary people, and he gets a sense of the kind of poetry, the kind of feeling that he wants to try and express in poetry. So the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. This is something that we'll see in his odes quite a lot. Someone's unmuted themselves, or I can hear someone's background noise. If you could unmute yourself, sorry, mute yourself, that'd be great. And a very important part of his poetry, especially these odes of 1819, which was kind of his most thought about poetry. He writes that he really took care to write these poems in a considered way. And he writes about something called negative capability, which is a term that he coined. At once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, in which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Coleridge, for instance, being incapable of remaining content with half knowledge. This pursued through volumes would perhaps take us no further than this, that with a great poet, the sense of beauty overcomes every other consideration, or rather obliterates all consideration. So negative capability, the art or the intention of being able to lose oneself, to approach a topic, to write about it, to feel about it, and not to really care where you end up. You're just getting lost in that particular realm of the mysterious. So the first ode that they think he wrote was Ode to Psyche. So this is one that he writes about sends to a friend in April or early May of 1819. So it's early in this few-month period when he's writing these odes. And it's about this story of Psyche and Cupid. And he reads a book by Apuleius called The Golden Ass, which is a sort of 2,000-year-old Roman story. And it's about this character, Psyche. A certain king and queen had 3 daughters. The charms of the 2 elder were more than common, but the beauty of the youngest was so wonderful that the poverty of language is unable to express its due praise. The fame of her beauty was so great that strangers from neighboring countries came in crowds to enjoy the sight and looked on her with amazement, paying her that homage which is due only to Venus itself. So first there's this aspect of this character who is beyond words for beauty. And Psyche became the symbol of the soul, and Cupid was love. And they eventually came together in this great love, this union between the soul and this sort of Godhead figure of love. And she was born mortal, but through her connection with Cupid, Eros, same thing, she then became divine. So it's this journey of the soul to become divine. And Keats realized that this figure of Psyche, she wasn't really worshipped at all. And this is what he writes about that in a letter. You must recollect that Psyche was not embodied as a goddess before the time of Apuleius, the Platonist, who lived after the Augustan age, and consequently the goddess was never worshipped or sacrificed to with any of the ancient fervour, and perhaps never thought of in the old religion. I am more orthodox than to let a heathen goddess be so neglected. So perhaps worshipping this pagan ideal of the soul, he is in his own life and through writing about it for the reader, creating this journey, this allowing of the soul to become more embodied or to become realized. Remember, he had this quote about the truth of the imagination, that they're somehow attaining the beauty of the soul by writing about it, by expressing it in a particular way. And the character of Psyche, she actually goes through trials in order to eventually become divine. And these are some just paintings of trials that she went through. She had to go down into the underworld, for example. So there's also the sense of the trials and tribulations that the soul goes through to become more divine or more able to realize its own beauty, something like this. Of course, trials and tribulations were a big part of Keats's very short life. The last little quote here before I start reading is a quote from one of Keats's letters about the state of kind of education and the state of people he saw, how they weren't really free with their imaginations. How sad is it when a luxurious imagination is obliged in self-defense to deaden its delicacy in vulgarity and riot in things attainable, that it may not have leisure to go mad after things which are not. And I just wanted to finish with this lovely picture in Ostia near Rome. I was there last year. I just found this statue of Psyche and Eros united together. So let's read the poem. Ode to Psyche. O goddess, hear these tuneless numbers, rung by sweet enforcement and remembrance dear, and pardon that thy secrets should be sung, even into thine own soft-conched ear. Surely I dreamt today, or did I see the winged Psyche with awakened eyes? I wandered in a forest thoughtlessly, and on the sudden, fainting with surprise, saw 2 fair creatures couched side by side, in deepest grass, beneath the whispering roof of leaves and trembled blossoms, where there ran a brooklet scarce espied. Mid hushed, cool-rooted flowers, fragrant-eyed, blue, silver-white, and budded Tyrian, they lay calm-breathing on the bedded grass, their arms embraced, and their pinions too. Their lips touched not, but had not bade adieu, as if disjoined by soft-handed slumber, and ready still past kisses to outnumber at tender eye-dawn of Aurorian love. the winged boy I knew. But who wast thou, O happy, happy dove? Is Psyche true? O latest born and loveliest vision, far of all Olympus's faded hierarchy, fairer than Phoebe's sapphire region star, or Vesper, amorous glowworm of the sky. Fairer than these, though temple thou hast none, nor altar heaped with flowers, nor virgin choir to make delicious moan upon the midnight hours. No voice, no lute, no pipe, no incense sweet from chain-swung censer teeming. No shrine, no grove, no oracle, no heat of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming. O brightest, thou too late for antique vows, too late for the fond believing lyre, when holy were the haunted forest boughs, holy the air, the water, and the fire. Yet even in these days so far retired from happy pieties, thy lucent fans fluttering among the faint Olympians, I see and sing by my own eyes inspired. So let me be thy choir and make a moan upon the midnight hours. Thy voice, thy lute, thy pipe, thy incense sweet, from swinged censer teeming, thy shrine, thy grove, thy oracle, thy heat of pale-mouthed prophet dreaming. Yes, I will be thy priest and build a fane in some untrodden region of my mind, where branched thoughts, new grown with pleasant pain, instead of pines, shall murmur in the wind. Far, far around shall those dark clustered trees fledge the wild-ridged mountains steep by steep. And there by zephyrs, streams, and birds and bees, the moss-lain dryads shall be lulled to sleep. And in the midst of this wide quietness, a rosy sanctuary will I dress, with the wreathed trellis of a working brain, with buds and bells and stars without a name, with all the gardener fancy e'er could feign, who breeding flowers will never breed the same. And there shall be for thee all soft delight that shadowy thought can win, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in. So another reason why Keats was ridiculed by the critics, the older generation of writers, was that he was trying to invent a new sonnet form. Not really invent, but he was trying to play with the existing forms of poetry. Older forms of sonnet from Petrarch and Horace and these sort of classical styles were very metered, they were very precise, and you could portray an emotion or some kind of situation quite nicely in a compact lyrical way. But Keats wanted to do more than that, to play with perspectives, to play with stories within stories, or describing objects and then coming out of describing them to describing his own inner state. So this is what you see in these sonnets. So it's quite a new, bold way of writing. In one of his classical history books, he saw some drawings of antiquities. And one drawing he saw is the Sisyphos vase, which I think is in the Louvre. I'm not sure exactly where it is now, sorry. But he saw it in a book and he traced it out here. You can see on the right, he traced it out just on a piece of paper. And he obviously became quite interested in this nature of art, the nature of beauty. When you look at something and you find it beautiful, that's one thing, that's a lovely feeling in itself. But when that object is really ancient, it brings up this question of immortality. This object creates a sense of beauty in the viewer, but that object might be 2,000 years old. So this object is a kind of emblem of this continuing beauty in every new person, in every new eye and brain and soul, a similar perhaps feeling of beauty, or some sense of, wow, I feel connected to this. That is amazing. It's inspiring. whatever word, I think beauty does quite fit that feeling as well, or a deep interest, something like this. So in this ode, he writes about this vase and about the nature of art and this continuation of this feeling of beauty. Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals, or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore ye soft pipes play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tongue. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal yet, do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss, for ever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Ah, happy, happy boughs, that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu. And happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new. More happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Who are these coming to sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leads thou that heifer lowing at the skies, and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed? What little town by river or seashore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of this folk, this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate, can e'er return. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe, and ours a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. From his medical days, he would have come across melancholy a lot. This is before kind of mental health awareness about what lower moods or higher moods really are. And melancholy was seen as a physical ailment, an imbalance of the humors. Melancholy in ancient Greek is just melancholia, which is black bile. So if you had an over large amount of black bile that was overbalancing the yellow bile, then you would feel sad and depressed and lazy and self-obsessed. And this was quite condemned or seen as a kind of a curse, even at this time. So it really was a cloud over the spirit, you know, it wasn't understood at all. But this in Ode on Melancholy, Keats is saying something quite different than just putting it down or saying that it's some kind of evil or an imbalance. He's saying to embrace it, to embrace essentially life in its reality, which is that in every beautiful thing, you enjoy the flower, but you know that it's going to die. It's impermanent, you know, joy can often be tinged with sadness because it is, it's going to fade, it's going to die. You can't make anything last forever. And this is from an extract from one of his letters when he writes about his troubles. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? So this ode on melancholy is, in a way, quite a life-affirming poem. Of course, it depends how you look at it, how you deal with those feelings of impermanence. But I think it's quite beautiful. Ode on Melancholy. Oh, one thing, one of the things he's saying, which is quite interesting for the modern age, is if you feel sad, don't go and drown out that sadness or take a huge sleeping pill and go to sleep. It's more of an integral, holistic thing to actually kind of feel it and embrace it, which I find quite an interesting sentiment at this time in the early 1800s. No, no, go not to Lethe, neither twist wolf's bane tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade, ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew berries, nor let the beetle nor the death moth be your mournful Psyche, nor the downy owl a partner in your sorrow's mysteries. For shade to shade will come too drowsily, and drown the wakeful anguish of the soul. But when the melancholy fit shall fall, sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud, that fosters the droop-headed flowers all, and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies, or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes. She dwells with beauty, beauty that must die, and joy, whose hand is ever at his lips, bidding adieu, and aching pleasure nigh, turning to poison while the bee mouth sips. Aye, in the very temple of delight, veiled melancholy has her sovereign shrine, though seen of none save him whose strenuous tongue can burst joy's grape against his palate fine. His soul shall taste the sadness of her might, and be among her cloudy trophies hung. And at some point in the spring or the summer of 1819, Keats was lying in the grass, dozing, quite empty, nothing really going on, quite peaceful. And suddenly his three main triggers or hooks appear: love, ambition, and poetry. And he sees them and goes, oh, I had nothing going on. I was quite peaceful. And now suddenly these temptations are here. Oh, yes, I should go and follow these things. No, actually, why? Love, I haven't got any time for it. Ambition, it's a folly. Poetry, you can't write in words the beauty that I'm feeling right now, just lying here. And this is the subject of the next ode, which is Ode on Indolence, or on sort of laziness or inactivity. And the poem begins with a short quote from the Bible, from Matthew. And why take ye thought for clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. So in this apparently effortless existing world of nature, of its apparent ease, it doesn't worry about where its next meal is coming from, how it's going to get its clothing. And suddenly you have then humans who are often worrying, and, you know, yeah, that's the sentiment. I think you get it. So it's quite an interesting idea for that time, which of course you can imagine was quite frowned upon by a more sort of rigid, earn your right to exist and try hard and work hard attitude. Ode on Indolence. They toil not, neither do they spin. One morn before me were 3 figures seen, with bowed necks and joined hands, side-faced, and one behind the other stepped serene, in placid sandals and in white robes graced. They passed like figures on a marble urn, when shifted round to see the other side. They came again, as when the urn once more is shifted round, the first seen shades return. And they were strange to me, as may betide with vases, to one deep in Phidian lore. How is it, shadows, that I knew ye not? How came ye muffled in so hush a mask? Was it a silent, deep disguised plot to steal away and leave without a task my idle days? Ripe was the drowsy hour, the blissful cloud of summer indolence benumbed my eyes, my pulse grew less and less. Pain had no sting, and pleasure's wreath no flower. Oh, why did ye not melt and leave my sense, unhaunted quite of all but nothingness? A 3rd time passed they by, and passing, turned each one the face a moment whiles to me, then faded. And to follow them I burned, and ached for wings, because I knew the 3. The first was a fair maid, and love her name. The second was ambition, pale of cheek, and ever watchful with fatigued eye. The last, whom I love more, the more of blame is heaped upon her, maiden most unmeek, I knew to be my demon Poesy. They faded, and forsooth, I wanted wings. Oh, folly! What is love, and where is it? And for that poor ambition, it springs from a man's little heart, short fever fit. For Poesy, no, she has not a joy, at least for me, so sweet as drowsy noons and evenings steeped in honeyed indolence. Oh, for an age so sheltered from annoy, that I may never know how change the moons, or hear the voice of busy common sense. And once more came they by, alas, wherefore? My sleep had been embroidered with dim dreams, my soul had been a lawn besprinkled o'er with flowers and stirring shades and baffled beams. The morn was clouded, but no shower fell, though in her lids hung the sweet tears of May. The open casement pressed a new-leafed vine, let in the budding warmth and throstles lay. O shadows, 'twas a time to bid farewell. Upon your skirts had fallen no tears of mine. So, ye 3 ghosts, adieu. Ye cannot raise my head cool-bedded in the flowery grass, for I would not be dieted with praise, a pet lamb in a sentimental farce. Fade softly from my eyes, and be once more in mask-like figures on the dreamy urn. Farewell. I yet have visions for the night, and for the day faint visions there is store. Vanish, ye phantoms, from my idle sprite, into the clouds, and never more return. So there is this story from one of Keats's friends that he was sitting in the garden outside this tree in the house, which is still there, and was very fascinated by this song of the Nightingale, and came in and wrote loads of papers down, and then that became Ode to a Nightingale. Another lodger at the time says that that's not true at all. So it's a nice story, but it's not really clear if it's exactly true. But he was very fascinated by this nightingale, this beautiful bird song. so free and melodious, and apparently so kind of joyful and warbling, which I don't think many exist in England now, which is, I don't know that for sure, but they're certainly not heard in Hampstead very often. And perhaps you noticed in these other odes before, these other poems, that there's a lot of very sensual language, like my head cool bedded, these new ways of mixing the senses with the cerebral, with everything. Everything's coming together in this kind of synesthesical thing, beyond just trying to go beyond just the words and into something more sensual. Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts. So I'm going to play just a quick extract of a nightingale singing. But before, just to give a sense of in the ode, how Keats shifts between taking comfort in this beautiful sound, but also compared to his own situation of melancholy, his own feeling of sadness, and yet burdened by thoughts. And yet this bird is just apparently with no effort, just in the branches of trees, putting out this incredible, incredible sound. So it goes between taking comfort in this, but also being left quite isolated, hearing this sound, and yet around him, and perhaps the human thinking condition is that you're somehow separated from this, and you can't experience that same kind of perhaps sort of animal joy, if you want to call it joy. It's not really joy anthropomorphizing, but I think again, you know what I mean. So here's the sound of a nightingale, and then I'll start reading it. Ode to a Nightingale. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and Lethe woods had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep-delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and leaden-eyed despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes, or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy. Though the dull brain perplexes and retards, already with thee. Tender is the night, and haply the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. But in embalmed darkness, Guess each sweet wherewith this seasonable month endows the grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild. White hawthorn and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many amused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Forlorn. The very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. Adieu. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades, past near the meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now it is buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So the last ode that he wrote is even more condensed and mature in a way. So it's just called To Autumn, not even Ode to Autumn. And this is the last ode he wrote, and potentially one of the last poems he ever wrote, just called To Autumn, in September of 1819, before he found out that he had tuberculosis and then went to Italy to try and recover in 1820. And he writes in a letter that he was in autumn time in Hampshire near Winchester, and he writes about how he feels about autumn. How beautiful the season is now, how fine the air, the temperate sharpness about it. I never liked stubble fields so much as now. Somehow a stubble plain looks warm, in the same way that some pictures look warm. This struck me so much in my Sunday's walk that I composed upon it. To Autumn. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells with a sweet kernel, to set budding more and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has o'erbrimmed their clammy cells. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while the hook spares the next swathe and all its twined flowers. And sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look, thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Where are the songs of spring? Aye, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day, and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue. Then in a wailful choir the small gnats mourn among the river sallows, borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft the red breast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. So a doctor recommends that he go to warmer climates. So he goes to Rome, lives in this house by the Spanish Steps, but his tuberculosis gets worse and worse. And in 1821, he takes his last breath and dies. The mask is made, so this is his death mask over here on the left. There are various papers that were connected between him and Shelley, poems and letters, that during the Second World War they were sent to Monte Cassino from the house in Rome for safekeeping in case of bombing. And the abbot of the monastery, when there was a threat of bombing at the actual monastery, he took these letters into his own private possessions and hid them in his own special box. So they were seen as very, very, very important. And he's buried in a cemetery in Rome as well, this grave here, with a broken lyre above his quote that he wanted on it. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. Yes, that's the end of the readings. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks very much for joining.